The calm before the storm. Marcus Grant and Darius Walker, both esteemed captains in the police force, were no strangers to long nights, challenging cases, and the weight of responsibility that came with their roles. They had spent years climbing the ranks, earning respect not just in their precincts but across the entire city. Tonight, however, as they drove home from a charity gala they had co-hosted to honor underprivileged youth, their world was about to shift in ways neither could have predicted. The night was unusually quiet, with only the hum of their tires on the smooth city streets and the distant glow of the skyline lighting their path. Both men sat in comfortable silence, reflecting on the success of the evening. Marcus, behind the wheel, glanced over at Darius with a small, satisfied smile. The event had gone smoothly, raising substantial funds for community programs that mattered deeply to them. It was moments like these that reminded them why they had dedicated their lives to public service. "I still can't believe how much we raised tonight," Darius said, breaking the silence, his voice filled with pride. "That's going to make a huge difference." Marcus nodded. "Yeah, it was a good night, a win for the community." As they cruised through a quiet residential neighborhood, the conversation shifted to lighter topics. They laughed about old memories, shared stories from their early days on the force, and talked about their plans for the future. Despite the gravity of their day-to-day responsibilities, they were just two friends enjoying a quiet drive home. That peace, however, was shattered in an instant. Blue and red lights flashed in the rearview mirror, accompanied by the sharp wail of a police siren. Marcus felt his heart skip a beat as Darius sat up straighter in his seat, his smile vanishing. "Seriously, we didn't even do anything," Darius muttered, his voice tinged with frustration. Marcus sighed. He had been pulled over enough times to recognize the feeling that accompanied it, a mixture of dread and resignation. He glanced at the speedometer. They weren't speeding. Everything had been in order, but that didn't seem to matter. He signaled and pulled the car over to the side of the road, keeping his hands visible on the steering wheel. Darius, now tense, looked at Marcus with concern. "What's the plan? Should we tell them who we are?" Marcus shook his head slightly. "Let's wait and see how they approach. We don't want to escalate anything." The irony of the situation wasn't lost on either of them. Two highly respected officers being pulled over by members of their own department felt surreal, but they knew better than to assume this stop would be routine, especially when the officers had no idea who they were dealing with. The cruiser came to a stop behind them, and two officers stepped out. Marcus kept his gaze forward, his heartbeat steady but louder than before. He wasn't nervous, he was cautious. He had learned long ago that being a black man, no matter how successful, came with certain risks during encounters with law enforcement. As the officers approached the vehicle, Marcus could make out their faces in the side mirror. One, younger and clearly more aggressive, led the charge. The other, slightly older, followed behind, his face unreadable in the dim streetlight. "License and registration." The younger officer barked as soon as he reached Marcus's window, skipping any pleasantries. Marcus complied, retrieving his wallet from the center console and handing over the requested documents without a word. Darius did the same, his movements slow and deliberate, as if trying to diffuse a situation that had already started on edge. "Is there a problem, officer?" Marcus asked, keeping his tone measured, though inside, he bristled at the officer's tone. The officer, whose name had read Riley, gave Marcus a hard look but didn't respond immediately. Instead, he glanced over the documents and shifted his gaze to Darius, narrowing his eyes as if searching for something. Anything to justify his next move. "You two look awfully familiar," Officer Riley muttered, suspicion lacing his words. "Step out of the vehicle." Darius glanced at Marcus, alarm flashing in his eyes. They had both been in situations like this before, but it never got easier. Marcus gave him a slight nod, signaling that they would comply for now. As they stepped out of the vehicle, hands visible and movements slow. Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. They had done nothing wrong, yet here they were being treated as suspects. Despite their high-ranking positions, tonight they were just two black men being subjected to an all-too-common experience. Officer Riley motioned for them to stand by the hood of the car, while the older officer, Grant, remained by the cruiser. The tension in the air was palpable, thick with unspoken accusations. "I'm going to run these," Riley said, holding up their licenses before turning on his heel and walking back to the patrol car. As the officers disappeared into their vehicle, Marcus and Darius stood in silence, the weight of the situation heavy on their shoulders. The flashing lights cast long shadows across the road, drawing the attention of the few passing cars. Drivers slowed as they passed, their curious gazes lingering on the scene as if trying to make sense of what was happening. "This is ridiculous," Darius muttered, his voice low but laced with frustration. "We're police captains, for God's sake." Marcus didn't respond immediately. His mind was racing, analyzing every possible outcome. They knew who they were, but the officers didn't, and that was what concerned him the most. He had seen how situations like this could spiral out of control, and despite his calm exterior, a part of him was preparing for the worst. Minutes ticked by, each one feeling like an eternity. Marcus's eyes flicked toward the patrol car, where Riley and Grant were likely running their information through the system. He wondered how long it would take for the officers to realize their mistake, to recognize that they weren't just pulling over any civilians, they were pulling over men who outranked them. But even as he waited, Marcus couldn't shake the underlying truth. This wasn't just about mistaken identity. It was about something much deeper, something that went beyond their badges or their ranks. Tonight, they weren't Captains Marcus Grant and Darius Walker. They were simply two black men, and that, in the eyes of the officers, seemed to be enough. The sound of footsteps approaching pulled Marcus from his thoughts. Officer Riley was coming back, but this time, there was a shift in his demeanor. The confidence in his stride had faltered, replaced by something resembling uncertainty. Marcus felt a small, grim satisfaction. The moment of reckoning was close. Riley stopped a few feet away, clearing his throat awkwardly. We didn't realize who you were," he began, his voice faltering. Marcus exchanged a glance with Darius, both men reading the same thing in each other's eyes. Too little, too late. But the night was far from over, and what followed would not only change the lives of the officers, but force a conversation about racial profiling, authority, and the long-overdue need for real change. This was just the beginning. The unfolding tension. The night had grown heavier since Marcus and Darius were forced out of their car, standing awkwardly under the oppressive gaze of the flashing police lights. Though Officer Riley had just begun to acknowledge their mistake, Marcus knew from years of experience that this was far from over. Mistakes like this one were not simply brushed off with a few words. They left scars, both visible and invisible, and tonight's incident would carry consequences that extended far beyond the roadside. Marcus stood tall, his posture calm but unyielding, as if every muscle in his body was braced for the impact of whatever was to come next. Darius, on the other hand, was visibly agitated. His breathing was shallow, his hands trembling slightly as they rested at his sides. Though they had both dealt with hostile situations on the force, there was something particularly unsettling about this one. Perhaps it was the knowledge that despite their rank, despite their success, they were being treated as criminals first, officers second. "They'll figure it out soon," Marcus said quietly, trying to offer his friend some reassurance, though he wasn't entirely sure he believed his own words. "Just stay calm." Darius shot him a look, his frustration simmering just beneath the surface. "Figure it out. We're standing here like suspects, Marcus. In cuffs. This is more than just a mistake." Marcus didn't respond. He didn't need to. They both knew that this situation wasn't just about a wrongful traffic stop. It was a symptom of something much larger, a system where race often dictated the course of events, more than facts ever could. Even as high-ranking officers, even as pillars of their community, they were not immune to the biases that infiltrated the very institution they worked for. As they stood waiting, the seconds dragged by like hours. The quiet of the night only served to amplify the tension between them and the officers. Officer Riley returned to the patrol car again, where his partner, Officer Grant, had been working silently, typing into the computer system. From where Marcus and Darius stood, they could see the two officers exchanging glances, their faces barely illuminated by the glow of the dashboard. "Maybe they're realizing now," Darius muttered bitterly, his eyes fixed on the patrol car, "that they just pulled over two of their superiors. They can't possibly dig their hole any deeper." Marcus raised an eyebrow, his face impassive. "Don't count on it." His tone was resigned, a man too familiar with how these situations could evolve, no matter the facts. He had seen it too many times. People like Officer Riley often found themselves doubling down, refusing to admit their mistakes, determined to maintain control of a situation that had already slipped from their grasp. The tension only thickened as the officers lingered in their car, seemingly grappling with how to handle the situation they had created. Finally, Officer Riley stepped out again, his face noticeably paler than before. The arrogant confidence from earlier had all but vanished. His partner, Officer Grant, was slower to follow, his face a mask of discomfort. Both officers approached Marcus and Darius with hesitant steps, like men walking toward a cliff's edge. Riley cleared his throat awkwardly, shifting on his feet as if trying to buy time to figure out what to say. "Look," Riley started, his voice lower than before, "we didn't realize who you were." Darius scoffed audibly, unable to hold back his disdain. "So, if we weren't captains, this would have been fine." Riley's mouth opened, but no words came out at first. His face flushed slightly as he fumbled for a response. "No, that's not what I'm saying." Marcus stepped in before things could escalate further. "What are you saying then? Because from where we're standing, this doesn't look like just a simple mistake." Riley's eyes darted to Officer Grant, who remained silent, his gaze fixed on the ground. It was clear neither officer had expected this situation to unfold the way it had. They had pulled over two black men, and now they were realizing the consequences of their actions extended far beyond the standard procedures of a traffic stop. "Well, there's been some confusion." Riley tried again, but his voice faltered under the weight of Marcus's steady gaze. "We thought the vehicle matched a description." Darius cut in, his voice sharp with anger. "You mean we matched a description?" The accusation hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. Riley's face reddened further, but he didn't deny it. He couldn't. "We're captains in the force," Marcus said, his voice calm but firm. "You've got our IDs. You know exactly who we are now. So why are we still standing here?" The shift in power was palpable. Where Riley had once stood with an air of authority, now he seemed almost small, fumbling to regain control of a situation that had spiraled out of his hands. Grant, sensing the growing tension, stepped forward, his voice softer than his partner's. "Captain Grant, Captain Walker, we didn't mean any disrespect," Officer Grant said, his tone apologetic. "It's just procedure, you know. We were following protocol." "Protocol?" Darius echoed, his voice incredulous. "Handcuffing us on the side of the road without cause, treating us like criminals." Grant shifted uncomfortably, but didn't respond. His silence spoke louder than any defense he could have offered. The reality of the situation was plain for all to see. This wasn't about protocol or procedure, it was about the unspoken biases that had driven their actions from the start. Marcus glanced at Darius, silently urging him to stay calm, though he understood his friend's frustration all too well. This wasn't the first time they had faced something like this, but it was one of the few times where the stakes were this high, where their positions of authority could make a tangible difference. "You're lucky," Marcus finally said, his voice cold but measured, "that we're not filing a formal complaint right now. But understand this, we're going to take this higher." Riley's face drained of what little color remained. He opened his mouth to protest, but Marcus cut him off with a look. "You think this is about us?" Marcus continued, stepping forward. "This is about what you do to men who don't wear badges. What happens to them when they don't have the privilege of flashing an ID to get out of handcuffs." For the first time, Officer Grant seemed to falter, his eyes widening with the weight of Marcus's words. Riley, however, remained rigid, as if trying to hold on to what little authority he still believed he had. "You should be grateful we're letting this go," Darius added, his voice low but filled with righteous anger. "But make no mistake, this isn't over." With that, Marcus and Darius turned back toward their vehicle. The sound of their footsteps echoed through the quiet night, punctuating the silence left in the wake of their words. The officers stood frozen, unsure of how to proceed, their once dominant posture crumbling beneath the realization of what they had done. As Marcus and Darius climbed back into their car, the tension in the air remained thick, but this time it was the officers who bore the weight of it. They had crossed a line, one they couldn't uncross, and the consequences of their actions would follow them far beyond this night. Driving away, Marcus kept his gaze fixed on the road ahead, his mind already turning to the inevitable fallout from the night's events. They would take this to their superiors, and the department would have no choice but to address it. But deep down, Marcus knew that real change wouldn't come from one incident, one mistake. It would take far more than that to dismantle the biases that had led to this moment. As they drove in silence, the weight of the night pressed heavily on them both. They had won a small victory tonight, but the war was far from over. The aftermath begins. The silence in the car was thick and oppressive as Marcus and Darius drove away from the scene of their wrongful arrest. The flashing police lights had faded into the distance, but the impact of the night's events weighed heavily on both men. Darius stared out the window, his jaw clenched tightly, while Marcus kept his focus on the road, his hands gripping the steering wheel just a little too firmly. They had won the confrontation, but the victory felt hollow. The humiliation of being handcuffed, the presumption of guilt based solely on their appearance, these were wounds that cut deep, wounds that would take more than a simple apology or a few words of regret to heal. They just couldn't help themselves, could they? Darius muttered, his voice filled with frustration. "Two black men dragging a nice car late at night, and they had to pull us over." Marcus didn't respond right away, his mind still processing everything that had happened. He understood Darius's anger, but he also knew that letting it fester would only lead to more frustration. This wasn't the first time they had encountered this kind of treatment, and it wouldn't be the last. But it was different this time, because this time, they had power. Power to change the narrative, power to hold those officers accountable. "Let's not lose focus, Darius," Marcus said finally, his voice calm but edged with determination. "What happened tonight isn't just about us. This is systemic, and we have a responsibility to address it, not just for ourselves, but for everyone who's been in our shoes." Darius turned to face Marcus, his brow furrowed. "So what are we going to do? File a complaint and hope they get a slap on the wrist?" "You know how this works, Marcus. They'll get a talking to, maybe a couple of weeks off, and then it'll be business as usual. We've seen it before." Marcus's jaw tightened. Darius wasn't wrong, and that was part of what made the situation so frustrating. As captains, they had seen firsthand how the system protected its own, how even the most egregious misconduct was often swept under the rug or dealt with behind closed doors. But this time felt different. This time, Marcus was determined to make sure the situation wasn't just forgotten. "I'm not looking for a slap on the wrist," Marcus said firmly. "I'm going to push this as far as it can go. Those officers need to face real consequences, and more importantly, the department needs to address the larger issue at play here. This isn't just about two bad apples. It's about a culture that allows this kind of behavior to continue unchecked. Darius shook his head, his frustration giving way to something closer to resignation. You're right, man. But how many times have we seen people try to push for change, only to hit a wall? The system is built to protect itself. Marcus exhaled slowly, keeping his gaze on the road. He knew Darius was right, but that didn't mean he was ready to give up. If anything, the fact that change was so difficult to achieve only strengthened his resolve. I'm tired of hitting walls, Marcus said quietly. It's time to break them down. The next morning, Marcus and Darius found themselves sitting in the office of Chief Anderson, the head of their police department. The tension in the room was palpable as the two men sat across from the chief, their expressions unreadable. Chief Anderson, a seasoned officer with decades of experience, was a man known for his no-nonsense approach to leadership. But today, there was something different in his demeanor. He was visibly uncomfortable, shifting in his seat as he reviewed the report in front of him. So, the chief began, his voice measured. I've gone over the incident report from last night, and I have to say, this is troubling. Darius snorted softly under his breath, but Marcus shot him a warning glance. They needed to stay professional, even if the chief's choice of words felt inadequate. Troubling is one way to put it, Marcus said, his tone even. We were handcuffed on the side of the road without cause, Chief. That's not just troubling, it's unacceptable. Chief Anderson sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. Look, Marcus, Darius, I know this situation was handled poorly. And believe me, I'm taking it very seriously. Officer Riley and Officer Grant are going to be reprimanded. With all due respect, Chief, Darius interrupted, leaning forward in his chair. Reprimanding them isn't enough. We both know how this goes. They'll get a warning, maybe a suspension, and then they'll be back on the streets, doing the same thing to someone else. Chief Anderson met Darius's gaze, and for a moment, the room was silent. He knew that both men sitting before him were right. The department had a problem, and last night's incident was just the latest symptom of a much larger issue. I'm not disagreeing with you, the chief said finally. What happened last night was wrong, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise. But you both know how delicate these situations are. We can't just go in guns blazing, no pun intended, and expect immediate results. There's a process. Marcus leaned back in his chair, his face unreadable. That's the problem, Chief. The process is broken. It protects officers like Riley and Grant instead of holding them accountable. And as long as that's the case, nothing's going to change. Chief Anderson sighed again, looking down at the report on his desk. So what do you suggest, Marcus? What do you want me to do here? Marcus exchanged a glance with Darius before speaking. We want a full investigation, not just into Riley and Grant, but into the culture of this department. We've been seeing too many incidents like this, and it's not just a few bad officers. It's a systemic issue, and it needs to be addressed at every level. The chief's eyes narrowed slightly. You're talking about something that goes beyond just this department. If we start investigating the culture here, it could ripple out to the entire city, the entire force. That's exactly what needs to happen, Marcus replied, his voice calm but firm. This isn't just about one department or one incident. It's about the way policing is done in this city and in this country. If we don't start addressing the root of the problem, it's never going to get better. For a moment, Chief Anderson was silent, his gaze shifting between Marcus and Darius. He could see the determination in their eyes, and he knew that they weren't going to back down. This wasn't just about their pride or their egos. It was about something much bigger than that. It was about justice, and about ensuring that what had happened to them wouldn't happen to anyone else. Finally, the chief nodded, his expression grim but resigned. All right, I'll authorize the investigation. But you need to understand that this is going to stir up a lot of trouble. People are going to push back, and it's not going to be easy. "We're not looking for easy," Darius said quietly. "We're looking for change." The days that followed were a whirlwind of meetings, interviews, and difficult conversations. The investigation into the department's culture was launched, and it quickly became clear that Marcus and Darius weren't alone in their experiences. Officers of color from across the city came forward, sharing stories of bias, discrimination, and the pervasive culture that allowed it to thrive. The investigation was met with resistance, as expected. Some officers resented the scrutiny, while others dismissed the complaints as exaggerated or isolated incidents. But as more and more stories came to light, it became impossible to ignore the fact that there was a problem. One that went far deeper than anyone had initially realized. For Marcus and Darius, the fight was exhausting, but it was necessary. Every time they walked into the precinct, they could feel the tension in the air, the way certain officers would glance at them with thinly veiled hostility. But they didn't waver. They knew that what they were doing was right, and they were determined to see it through, no matter the cost. Weeks passed, and the investigation began to yield results. Officers were disciplined, new training programs were implemented, and discussions about reforming the department's policies were put on the table. But Marcus knew that this was just the beginning. Real change would take time, years perhaps, but for the first time in a long time, it felt like progress was being made. Late one night, after a particularly grueling day, Marcus and Darius sat in Marcus's office, nursing cups of coffee. The room was quiet, the only sound the hum of the air conditioning and the distant chatter of officers in the hallway. "We're doing it," Darius said quietly, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "We're actually making a difference." Marcus nodded, though his expression remained serious. "Yeah, but there's still a long way to go." Darius chuckled softly. "There's always a long way to go." Marcus leaned back in his chair, taking a sip of his coffee. He knew Darius was right. The road ahead would be long and difficult, but for the first time in a long time, Marcus felt a sense of hope. The system might be broken, but it wasn't beyond repair. And as long as they were willing to fight for it, change was possible. The road to justice. The investigation into the police department had gained significant momentum in the weeks following Marcus and Darius's wrongful arrest. What had initially been dismissed as a minor misunderstanding was now a full-blown inquiry into the systemic biases within the force. Officers, both high-ranking and new recruits, were being questioned, their records scrutinized, and their actions put under a microscope. It was the kind of accountability that had been lacking for far too long. But as the investigation unfolded, Marcus and Darius found themselves facing a different kind of battle, one that had less to do with formal procedures and more to do with the unspoken rules that governed the department. The blue wall of silence, that unspoken code of loyalty among officers, was cracking under the weight of the investigation, and not everyone was happy about it. Rumors swirled around the precinct, whispers of resentment and betrayal, accusations of disloyalty. Officers who had once been friendly with Marcus and Darius now avoided them, their conversations cutting off abruptly when either man entered the room. The atmosphere was thick with tension, as if at any moment, the fragile peace in the department could shatter. It was a Thursday morning when Marcus arrived at the precinct, his mind already turning over the details of the day ahead. He had a meeting scheduled with the city's Internal Affairs Division, and he knew the next few hours would be grueling. Every time he walked into these meetings, he was reminded of just how deeply entrenched the problems in the system were. But today felt different. There was a sense of urgency in the air, a sense that the investigation was about to reach a critical turning point. As he walked through the precinct, he could feel the weight of eyes on him. Some of his colleagues offered him curt nods, while others turned away altogether. The walls seemed to buzz with a low-level hum of discomfort, the kind that came when people were forced to confront truths they'd long ignored. When Marcus reached his office, Darius was already there, leaning against the desk with a stack of papers in his hand. He looked up as Marcus entered, his expression grim. "They're not happy about this," Darius said, gesturing to the papers in his hand. "I've been hearing things, man. Some of the officers, they're not taking this well." Marcus dropped his bag on the chair and sighed. "I'm not surprised. Change makes people uncomfortable, especially when it threatens the status quo." Darius shook his head, frustration evident in his voice. "This is more than just discomfort, Marcus. Some of them are talking about retaliation. They're saying we're going to bring the whole department down. There's even talk that some of the higher-ups want to shut the investigation down before it goes any further." Marcus narrowed his eyes. "Retaliation. What, they think they can intimidate us into dropping this?" Darius shrugged, tossing the papers onto the desk. "They've been using intimidation tactics for years, you know that. It's not just about us. It's about preserving a system that benefits them." Marcus sat down, rubbing his temples. "They're scared. They see the writing on the wall. This investigation could expose a lot more than they're ready to admit." Darius sat across from him, folding his arms. "So, what do we do? Push harder?" Marcus leaned back in his chair, his eyes fixed on the ceiling as he considered their next move. He had always known that this investigation would face resistance, but he hadn't expected it to happen so quickly or so fiercely. Still, they had come too far to back down now. "We keep pushing," Marcus said finally, his voice resolute. "We can't stop now. The investigation has already uncovered too much. If we pull back, nothing changes. The system stays the same, and everything we've done so far will have been for nothing." Darius nodded, though the tension in his shoulders didn't ease. "You're right. But we need to be smart about this. They're going to come at us hard, Marcus. We can't let them catch us off guard." Marcus's eyes flicked toward the door, where he could hear the faint sounds of officers moving through the precinct, their conversations muted but intense. He knew Darius was right. They couldn't afford to underestimate the lengths some would go to protect themselves. The stakes were higher now than they had ever been. Later that afternoon, Marcus and Darius sat in the conference room, flanked by the investigators from Internal Affairs. The meeting was a formal review of the findings so far, and the room was filled with thick binders of evidence, reports, testimonies, records of complaints that had been ignored or swept under the rug for years. Marcus had spent countless hours poring over these documents, and each new discovery only deepened his resolve. Detective Angela Vargas, the lead investigator on the case, was at the head of the table, her sharp eyes scanning the room as she spoke. Vargas was known for her tenacity, and she had quickly become an ally in the fight to uncover the truth. She didn't mince words, and today was no exception. "We've uncovered patterns of misconduct going back years," Vargas said, flipping through one of the binders. "Officers like Riley and Grant are just the tip of the iceberg. We're seeing a culture of racial profiling, excessive force, and a lack of accountability. The question now is how deep this goes, and how we deal with it." Marcus leaned forward, his eyes locked on Vargas. "What's the next step? How do we take this further?" Vargas looked up, her expression serious. "The next step is to expand the investigation. We need to look at the leadership. The problem isn't just with individual officers. It's with the way the department has been run for years. We're going to need to question some high-ranking officials. And I'm warning you now, it's going to get ugly." Darius sighed, leaning back in his chair. "Ugly's fine. We're used to that. But are you saying this could go all the way up to the top?" Vargas nodded. "It's possible. We've already found evidence that some of the higher-ups were aware of the complaints but did nothing. If we keep pulling on this thread, we might unravel something much bigger than we expected." Marcus felt a surge of both anticipation and dread. This was what they had been working toward: real accountability, real change. But the prospect of going up against the leadership of the department, people they had worked alongside for years, was daunting. There would be consequences, not just for the officers under investigation, but for Marcus and Darius as well. "Let them come for us," Marcus said quietly, more to himself than to anyone else in the room. "We're not backing down." Vargas gave him a sharp nod, her respect for his determination clear. "Good, because once we go public with this, there's no turning back." As the investigation moved forward, tensions within the department continued to rise. Officers were divided. Some supported Marcus and Darius's efforts, recognizing the need for change, while others resented what they saw as a betrayal. The atmosphere in the precinct became more hostile with each passing day. Marcus and Darius found themselves the targets of subtle but unmistakable acts of retaliation. Their cars were vandalized in the precinct parking lot. Anonymous threats were left in their mailboxes, and rumors about their personal lives began circulating among the ranks. It was clear that some of their colleagues were trying to push them out, to silence them before the investigation went any further. But Marcus and Darius refused to be intimidated. They had been through too much, had seen too many injustices, to back down now. They continued to work with internal affairs, uncovering more and more evidence of systemic corruption and misconduct. And with every new piece of evidence, the case against the department's leadership grew stronger. One evening, after a particularly long day of reviewing files and interviewing officers, Marcus sat alone in his office, the weight of everything pressing down on him. He knew they were getting closer to a breaking point, and he couldn't help but wonder what would happen when they finally crossed that line. His thoughts were interrupted by a knock on the door. Darius stepped in, looking as exhausted as Marcus felt, but there was a spark of determination in his eyes. "You ready for this?" Darius asked, leaning against the doorframe. Marcus looked up at his friend, his partner in this fight, and nodded. "Yeah, I'm ready." Darius smiled, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Good, because I've got a feeling things are about to get even messier." Marcus stood, stretching out the tension in his shoulders. "Let them. We're in this now, Darius. No turning back." As they left the office together, walking through the quiet precinct, Marcus couldn't help but feel a sense of grim satisfaction. They had set something in motion, something that couldn't be stopped. The road to justice was long and filled with obstacles, but Marcus and Darius were prepared to see it through, no matter how messy it got. The backlash intensifies. As the investigation continued to gather steam, the atmosphere in the precinct grew more hostile by the day. Marcus and Darius had expected pushback, but they hadn't anticipated the level of resistance that was starting to unfold. It wasn't just the officers who had been implicated in the investigation that were becoming defensive. Even those who hadn't been named or directly involved in any misconduct were reacting as though they were personally under attack. The unspoken rules of the department were clear: loyalty above all. For some, that loyalty meant protecting the institution at any cost, even if it meant turning a blind eye to injustices within their own ranks. The more Marcus and Darius pushed for accountability, the more they were seen as traitors. It started subtly. A conversation would abruptly end when one of them entered the room. Officers who once joked and exchanged stories with them now avoided eye contact. Meetings grew tense, and the camaraderie that once existed felt like it had vanished. But then, the hostility became more overt. It was a Monday morning when Marcus found a note in his locker. Folded neatly and tucked between his gym bag and his badge, it was scrawled in messy handwriting. "Snitches get stitches." Marcus stared at the note for a long moment, the weight of it pressing down on him like a physical force. He had heard those words before, on the streets, from gang members, from criminals who operated by their own code. But to see it here, in the precinct, among his fellow officers, it shook something deep inside him. He crumpled the note in his fist, taking a deep breath to steady himself before leaving the locker room. He didn't need to tell Darius about it. They both knew the risk they were taking. This wasn't about a single case or a few bad cops. They were challenging a culture that had thrived in the shadows for too long, and the culture was fighting back. That afternoon, Marcus and Darius were summoned to Chief Anderson's office. They had been called in for a debrief on the progress of the investigation, but Marcus suspected there was something more to the meeting. The tension in the department had reached a boiling point, and he could feel it simmering beneath the surface of every conversation, every glance that lingered too long. As they entered the chief's office, they found not just Chief Anderson, but Detective Vargas from Internal Affairs and Deputy Chief Monroe, one of the highest-ranking officers in the city's police force. Monroe was a formidable presence, a man whose reputation for being tough but fair had earned him respect across the department. But today, his expression was one of grim determination. "Sit down, gentlemen," Monroe said, his voice clipped as he gestured to the chairs in front of the desk. Marcus and Darius exchanged a glance before taking their seats. The air in the room was thick with unspoken tension, and Marcus could already tell that this meeting was going to be more than a simple update. "We need to talk about the direction this investigation is heading," Monroe began, leaning forward with his hands clasped on the desk in front of him. "You've uncovered a lot in the past few weeks, more than we initially expected." Marcus nodded, but he could sense there was a but coming. "But," Monroe continued, his eyes locking onto Marcus's, "there's growing concern that this investigation is becoming a distraction. The department is under a lot of scrutiny, and morale is at an all-time low. Officers are feeling like they're being targeted, and it's creating a toxic environment." Darius couldn't hold back. "A toxic environment? You're saying the investigation is the problem, not the misconduct we're uncovering?" Monroe's gaze shifted to Darius, his expression hardening. "I'm saying the way this investigation is being handled is causing a lot of unrest. There's talk of division, of officers not trusting each other. We're seeing fractures in the very foundation of this department." Marcus leaned forward, his voice steady but firm. "Deputy Chief, with all due respect, this department was fractured long before we started this investigation. What we're seeing now is the result of years of ignoring the problem. If we don't address it, things are only going to get worse." Monroe's jaw tightened. "I understand your position, Marcus. I do. But I'm telling you, there are limits to how far this can go. We have to think about the future of this department. Officers are starting to question whether they can do their jobs without constantly looking over their shoulders, wondering if they're going to be the next target of this investigation." Marcus felt a surge of frustration rise in his chest. They should be looking over their shoulders if they're engaging in misconduct. That's the whole point. We can't keep protecting people who abuse their power. Chief Anderson, who had been silent until now, finally spoke up, his voice measured but weary. "No one is saying we shouldn't hold people accountable, Marcus, but we need to be careful about how we proceed. There's a lot at stake here." Darius shook his head, his voice laced with disbelief. "So what are you saying? That we should back off? Let things go back to the way they were?" "No," Vargas interjected, her sharp gaze cutting through the tension. "We're not backing off. But the reality is that this investigation is going to have political consequences, and we need to be prepared for that. The department is being watched closely, not just by the public, but by city officials, the media, and other law enforcement agencies. How we handle this will set the tone for the future." Marcus understood what Vargas was getting at, but it didn't make it any easier to swallow. The investigation was exposing deep-rooted issues, and the more they uncovered, the more resistance they faced. It was like trying to tear down a wall brick by brick, only to find that the foundation was rotted through. "So what's the plan?" Marcus asked, his voice quieter now, more contemplative. "How do we move forward without compromising what we've already uncovered?" Monroe sighed, leaning back in his chair. "We need to focus, narrow the scope. The more we try to tackle everything at once, the more we risk losing control of the narrative. We go after the officers we know are the worst offenders. Riley and Grant, for example, make an example out of them." Marcus clenched his jaw. He knew that focusing on individual officers might yield quicker results, but it wouldn't address the systemic nature of the problem. Still, He also understood the political realities of the situation. If they pushed too hard, they could lose the entire investigation. "I get it," Marcus said slowly. "But we need to make sure that this doesn't just end with a few scapegoats. The whole system needs to be reevaluated, and that means taking a hard look at how we're training officers, how we're holding them accountable, and how we're dealing with complaints from the community." Vargas nodded in agreement. "That's why this can't stop with Riley and Grant. We need to present this in a way that forces the department to adopt real reforms. Training, oversight, community involvement. Those are the things that will make a lasting difference." Monroe didn't look entirely convinced, but he nodded nonetheless. "We'll see what we can do. But I'm telling you now, the backlash is only going to get worse. The more you uncover, the more people are going to push back." Marcus met Monroe's gaze, his expression resolute. "Let them push. We're not stopping." The next few weeks were some of the most intense of Marcus and Darius's careers. The investigation continued to uncover troubling patterns of behavior, and the Internal Affairs Department worked tirelessly to gather evidence that would lead to formal charges against the officers involved. But as Monroe had predicted, the backlash was fierce. Anonymous threats continued to pile up. Some left on their desks, others emailed to them from fake accounts. At one point, Darius's car was keyed, deep scratches running the length of the vehicle, a clear message that someone wanted them to stop. And then there were the rumors, whispers that Marcus and Darius were only pursuing the investigation for personal gain, that they were trying to curry favor with city officials to advance their own careers. It was all designed to wear them down, to make them question whether the fight was worth it. But for Marcus and Darius, it only fueled their determination. One evening, after a particularly grueling day of meetings, Marcus sat in his office, staring at the wall. The precinct was quiet, most of the officers having gone home for the night. He was exhausted, physically, mentally, emotionally. But even as the weight of it all pressed down on him, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were on the verge of something important. Something that could change the way the department operated for good. A knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. Darius stepped in, looking just as tired as Marcus felt, but there was a spark of hope in his eyes. "You're not going to believe this," Darius said, holding up a stack of papers. "We've got witnesses, officers who are willing to come forward." Marcus blinked, sitting up straighter. "Witnesses? Who?" "Junior officers, mostly," Darius explained, walking over to the desk. "They've seen what's been going on, but they've been too scared to say anything, until now. They're ready to testify. Marcus, we've got real momentum." Marcus took the papers from Darius, flipping through them. Names, statements, corroborating evidence, it was all there. And it was exactly what they needed to take the investigation to the next level. He looked up at Darius, a slow smile spreading across his face. "We've got them." Darius grinned, the weight of the past few weeks lifting just a little. "Yeah, we do." But even as they celebrated this small victory, Marcus knew that the fight was far from over. The backlash would only intensify, and the stakes would continue to rise. But for the first time in a long time, he felt a sense of real hope. They were making a difference, and they weren't going to stop until the job was done. The reckoning. It was early morning when Marcus Grant arrived at the courthouse, the dawn sky still bruised with the remnants of night. Today would be the culmination of weeks, no, months of grueling investigation, bitter conflict, and tireless work. The hallways buzzed with a different kind of energy, one that spoke of anticipation, uncertainty, and fear of what the next few hours would bring. It wasn't just the trial of Officers Riley and Grant that was on the docket today. It was the entire culture of a department that had long operated under a shroud of secrecy, one that Marcus and Darius had pulled back, exposing the ugly truths hidden beneath. Marcus parked his car and sat for a moment, staring at the massive stone building looming before him. It wasn't the first time he had been in court. He had testified in countless cases during his career as a police officer and captain. But today, the stakes felt different. Today, he wasn't just here to testify against two rogue officers. Today, he was here to help dismantle the system that had allowed men like them to thrive. He stepped out of the car and made his way toward the courthouse entrance. The media had already gathered, cameras and reporters packed tightly behind barricades. As soon as they spotted Marcus, a ripple went through the crowd, and reporters rushed forward, shouting questions, their voices blending into a chaotic symphony of demands. "Captain Grant, do you think Riley and Grant will be convicted? How do you respond to the claims that this investigation is politically motivated? Do you feel safe, given the backlash from your colleagues?" Marcus ignored the barrage of questions, pushing through the crowd with his head held high. He had given his statements, spoken to the press when necessary, but today wasn't about sound bites. Today was about action. Behind him, he heard the familiar voice of Darius, who was doing his best to deflect the media's attention. Together, they moved past the reporters and into the courthouse. Inside, the atmosphere was markedly different. It was quieter, but the tension was no less palpable. As they walked through the hallways toward the courtroom, Marcus and Darius exchanged a glance. They didn't need words to communicate what they were both feeling, a mixture of determination and exhaustion. It had been a long road to get to this point, and they were both ready for whatever came next. The courtroom was already packed by the time they entered, filled with officers, legal teams, and members of the community. On one side, a cluster of officers sat with their arms crossed, their faces etched with a mixture of anger and resentment. They were the ones who had stood in opposition to the investigation from the start, who believed that Marcus and Darius had betrayed the department by pushing for reform. On the other side sat the families of citizens who had been wronged by the system, the ones whose complaints had been ignored or dismissed, whose lives had been upended by the very people sworn to protect them. At the front of the room, Riley and Grant sat with their defense attorneys, their faces hard and unreadable. Marcus had seen them both in better days, days when they were part of the same team, when they were supposed to have been on the same side of the law. But those days felt like a lifetime ago. Now they were on opposite sides, and whatever camaraderie had once existed had long since eroded. The judge entered, and the room fell into a heavy silence as everyone rose. Marcus and Darius took their seats near the front, the weight of the moment pressing down on them both. The trial began with opening statements from the prosecutor, who wasted no time laying out the case against Riley and Grant. The charges were serious: racial profiling, unlawful arrest, abuse of power. Marcus and Darius had both been instrumental in gathering the evidence that had led to this moment, and as the prosecutor spoke, they felt a grim satisfaction. For too long, officers like Riley and Grant had operated with impunity, shielded by a system that had protected them from accountability. But today, the shield had been stripped away, and there was no hiding from the truth. When it was Marcus's turn to testify, he stood and made his way to the witness stand. As he was sworn in, he glanced briefly at Riley and Grant, who refused to meet his gaze. Then he turned his attention to the prosecutor. "Captain Grant," the prosecutor began, "can you describe, in your own words, the events that led to the wrongful arrest of you and Captain Walker?" Marcus took a deep breath and began recounting the night they had been pulled over. He spoke clearly and calmly, detailing how they had been treated like criminals from the moment the officers approached their car, how they had been handcuffed without cause, how their identities had been ignored until it was too late. The room was silent as he spoke, the weight of his words settling over everyone like a heavy fog. "Did you feel," the prosecutor asked, "that you were treated this way because of the color of your skin?" Marcus's eyes flicked to Riley and Grant, who were both staring down at the table in front of them. "Yes," he said quietly. "I do." The prosecutor nodded, then gestured toward the binders of evidence stacked on the table. And during the course of the investigation that followed, Did you uncover evidence of similar incidents involving other black citizens of this city? Yes, Marcus replied, his voice steady. We found numerous complaints filed by black citizens who had been stopped, searched, or arrested without cause. In many of those cases, the complaints were ignored or dismissed by the department. The prosecutor turned to face the jury. Captain Grant, in your professional opinion, is this an isolated incident, or is it indicative of a larger problem within the department? Marcus didn't hesitate. It's part of a larger problem. A culture of racial bias that's been allowed to fester for years. The courtroom buzzed with hushed whispers at Marcus's words. This was what the entire trial hinged on. Whether Riley and Grant were simply two bad officers, or whether they were part of a system that had been built on a foundation of discrimination. When Marcus finished his testimony, he returned to his seat beside Darius. He could feel the eyes of the room on him, the weight of the truth he had just laid bare hanging in the air. As the trial wore on, more witnesses were called to the stand. Citizens who had been wronged by the system. Junior officers who had witnessed the misconduct firsthand, but had been too afraid to speak out until now. Each new testimony chipped away at the defense's argument that this was just a misunderstanding, that Riley and Grant had simply made a mistake. It was becoming increasingly clear that this wasn't just about two officers. It was about the culture that had allowed them to believe they could act with impunity. When Darius took the stand, his testimony was just as damning. He spoke of the years he had spent on the force, the things he had seen and experienced, the way black officers and citizens alike were treated differently from their white counterparts. His voice was filled with both anger and pain as he described how, even after rising to the rank of captain, he still found himself on the receiving end of discrimination. By the time the defense presented their case, it was clear that they were fighting an uphill battle. The evidence was overwhelming, and the testimonies from both Marcus and Darius had struck a nerve with the jury. The defense's attempts to paint Riley and Grant as victims of circumstance fell flat, and as the trial neared its conclusion, the mood in the courtroom shifted. The closing arguments were made, and the jury was sent to deliberate. Marcus and Darius waited outside the courtroom, the tension between them palpable. They had done everything they could. Now, it was up to the jury to decide what kind of justice would be served. Hours passed, each one stretching longer than the last. Marcus paced the hallway, his mind racing with thoughts of what would happen if the jury didn't convict. Would the investigation be for nothing? Would Riley and Grant walk free, vindicated by a system that had failed them all? Finally, the jury returned. The courtroom was silent as the verdict was read. Guilty. The word hung in the air, reverberating through the room. Marcus exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding, his shoulders sagging with relief. It wasn't just a victory for him and Darius. It was a victory for everyone who had been wronged, for everyone who had been told that their lives didn't matter as much as the people in power. But as Marcus stood, shaking hands with the prosecutor and accepting the quiet congratulations from those around him, he knew that this was just the beginning. Riley and Grant would face justice, but the work was far from over. The system itself still needed to be rebuilt, from the ground up. As he left the courtroom, the media swarmed once again, cameras flashing, reporters shouting questions. But Marcus didn't stop. He walked past them, Darius at his side, knowing that they had won this battle. But the war for real change was still ahead. And they were ready to fight.